Throughout House of Cards, we see a common theme: manipulation. Kevin Spacey plays the role of Frank Underwood, the whip in Congress, and essentially that means it is his job to make sure people are voting for the correct bills. So throughout the show, we see him bring congressmen to the other side of an argument, so that certain bills will pass and certain will not. Where his true talent for manipulating people becomes very prominent is not with people voting for bills. He is amazing at influencing people in all aspects of his work, even when he is not convincing people to vote on bills. In Frank's world, everyone is a pawn, a part of a greater picture, and it seems as though Frank has the whole world figured out. Every move that Frank makes is carefully thought out and executed with precision. This is where his skill for manipulating people comes into play. The reason why he is so good at manipulating people is because when he talks to a person who he wants to do something, he plants the idea in their head without the person even knowing, and eventually that person will be as stupid as to think it was their very own idea, and Frank didn't even suspect it. Well, he does. My favorite example of this happening is when he is speaking to a man named Donald, who is freaking out because his draft of the education bill has been leaked by Frank himself. Now Donald was the original designer of the bill, but now that the general public has seen his first copy of the bill, he feels too much pressure, and after talking to Frank, he tells him that he thinks Frank should be the new leader of the bill, just as Frank wanted. Donald didn't realize this, but he had just fallen into a trap. Everything that has just happened went exactly the way Frank wanted it to happen. Frank says it best: "What a martyr craves more than anything is a sword to fall on. So you sharpen the blade, hold it at just the right angle, and then 3, 2, 1. Donald falls on the sword." Frank was so sure that Donald would fall on the sword, he already had 6 people in a room across the hall working on the bill. Another example of Frank manipulating someone in the workspace is with Peter Russo. He takes over Peter Russo while he attempts to run for governor. He even convinces him that not fight for the shipyard to remain open is the right thing to do. A choice that leaves 12,000 people jobless, making Russo look terrible, and who we see most angry is his old friend, seen in this shot, who lost his job, and the blood is on Russo's hands, all thanks to Frank. Frank is able to influence the media with the help of Zoe in an excellent example. Frank gets the people to side with the government instead of the teachers' union because he gets Stamper, his assistant, to throw a brick through his window, while making people think the teachers are a violent cause. Pure genius. During the process of the education bill being passed in Frank's hometown, there is an incident of a girl being killed while texting and driving, and Frank is blamed. Frank is blamed because the girl was texting another boy about a water tower she was driving by. A water tower put there by Frank. Frank travels to the town to talk to the parents of the girl, who are considering suing Frank and the government, and that is not what they need at that time. So what Frank does is he uses his tactics to convince the family not to press any sort of charges. At first, he arrives at a morning in the churchyard, and the parents yell at him and are very discouraged. Frank then makes a speech the next day at Sunday morning mass and is able to get the majority of the audience on his side. He whips them around. His speech is literally designed to change the minds of the people and manipulate them. He speaks of hatred and how some people may be hatred towards God right now for what he has done, but it is their jobs to understand God has a bigger plan, which is ironic because so does Frank. At one point, he sympathizes with the parents by telling them that he too had lost his father when he was just a young boy, and he too was furious with God. He then has an aside and admits he never really knew his father very well, and it did not affect him in that way. He goes on to be very heartwarming and nice to the parents of the girl, and eventually, after a Sunday brunch, they accept his forgiveness and decide not to press charges on Frank and his team. Frank is the reason that they were able to cope with the death of their daughter. Whether or not he was meaningful, he did change their mind and influence them heavily. Mr. Spinella is another man Frank manipulates with ease. Frank is having a tough time passing the education bill with many teachers who are striking, and the man behind it is Mr. Spinella. Frank attempts to get under his skin, and of course it works flawlessly. Mr. Spinella ends up punching Frank, a felony, putting all of his strikes to shit. All Frank wanted to do while they were in that room was for Frank to get punched, and that is exactly what happened. There are 3 main women in Frank's life: Linda, Claire, and Zoe, all of which are pawns in his huge scheme. Zoe is a reporter who Frank is also sleeping with. In the beginning of it, she was no more than an outlet for Frank to report insider news to. But Frank continues the relationship sexually and continues to have sex with her. Zoe thinks she is an important aspect to Frank's life, and though she is, Frank sees her as another piece to the puzzle, convincing her to do whatever Frank wants. Frank's wife, Claire, is another piece to his puzzle, but in this relationship they both use each other because their main goal is to gain power, for both of them. The best example for this scenario is when Frank and Mr. Spinella have a debate on CNN, and Frank clearly uses Claire to manipulate the crowd into feeling empathy for himself. He is even called out by Mr. Spinella, but Claire doesn't seem to be bothered by it. On a side note, even Claire has the ability to manipulate people. In a specific example, we see Claire manipulate a woman who works for her to fire almost 20 people. The woman does not want to do it, but for the sake of her job, she does what her boss asks her to do. And in the end, Claire finishes with firing that woman. Lastly, Linda is a co-worker with Frank, and while speaking to Frank, she never realizes it, but she is always being manipulated. While she speaks to him on the new Speaker of the House, little Frank wants her to ask him is, "Who do you think should be it?" And lo and behold, she ends up asking him, just like he wants. The rumor going around is that a woman named Catherine Durant will be the next one, an idea that Frank easily put in the media with the help of Zoe. All these examples of manipulation help Frank to go where he wants. It is Frank's world. Everyone else is just a pawn.